Okay, so by way of introduction, my name is Julie Stoddard, and I am currently the center coordinator at Brigham Young University. We have a Center for Family History and Genealogy. We do various research projects here, like I manage a project where we use DNA and family history to help prevent hereditary cancer. We have a variety of projects, like an early British census project, an immigrant ancestors project. So I work here at the center and help mentor students on doing family history, which basically is my dream job. So I'm one of those lucky people. And by way of background, I have a bachelor's and a master's in family history. When I did my master's, I chose to do my thesis on DNA research in family history. So this topic today is my favorite topic, and I want to help you understand why DNA is useful and then how to use it. And I know a lot of you are in situations where you're helping other patrons maybe, and they're interested in family history and they'll ask you questions. And so the hope is to give you a better background. So again, as I mentioned before, the way I teach is I love to have questions. I want you to understand it as we go. So you can raise your hand either electronically or just interrupt and say, can I ask a quick question? And I'm happy to take those. So two things we want to do is, first of all, we want to talk about understanding DNA, and a little background in DNA and how it works will help you understand then how you can use it to build your family tree. So DNA, when you think of doing your family history, sometimes we'll use a census record or a birth or a marriage record. DNA is another type of record. It provides evidence to help us document our genealogy relationships. And because it's a unique type of evidence, it can also help us break through some of the brick walls that we haven't been able to get through in other ways. So as you start learning about DNA, you'll find that it's a little bit like learning a foreign language, in that there's some concepts and terms and some of the application on how to use the evidence. Sometimes it's helpful to hear it 4 or 5 times, and then you'll start saying, oh, I think I get that now. So that's one of the reasons for the handout, is it's just all the slides so you can go back and review it and try and start piecing it together. So some of the terms that we're going to be talking today are about the different chromosomes. So if you look here in the cell, in the nucleus of the cell, we have this chromosome. Okay, and you can see that it's 2 different strands that are joined here together. That's called the centromere. And then if you unwind the chromosome here, they've unwound it, and you start to look at the very individual pieces, you'll come down here and see that this line, this twisted strand, is what they call a gene. So from this point on your DNA down to here would be considered a gene that affects your hair color, or maybe one that makes you tall or short. So those are your genes. And those genes are made up of these little nucleotides, which just you don't need to be able to understand all of these terms on a test. But what is important to understand is that these nucleotides are made up of these proteins. You've got the guanine, cysteine, adenine, and thymine. And these bond together and they make these segments. You have a DNA segment, and it just is made up of, if you were to look at your raw DNA, it would say G, C, A, and T. And you might go G, G, A, and then T, T, C, G, and that would be a DNA segment. And so when we're comparing your DNA with your DNA matches segment, it's just looking to see if your G's and C's and A's and T's all line up in the same order. So that's a very simplistic way to think of it, but that's what's happening underneath, as it's comparing your DNA to other people who've taken a DNA test. So one thing that's important to remember is that you have 2 copies of each of your autosomal chromosomes. You get one 50% from your dad, and the other one, the 50%, is from your mom. And you can see here on these chromosomes, they actually number them from biggest to smallest. So number 1 is your longest chromosome, and then it comes down to 22. And then you also have the X and Y chromosome. And unless you're female, then you'll have 2 X chromosomes. So when you picture all of these chromosomes together, then you'll start to hear the different type of DNA tests that can test these types of DNA. So there's actually 4 types of DNA tests that are being used in family history. So the autosomal DNA is the most popular one. Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, they're all testing autosomal DNA. And those are the 22 chromosomes. These are your autosomes. So they call it autosomal DNA. There's also tests who will just look at your X DNA, which you would have inherited from your mother. Or if you're male, then you can take a Y DNA test, and that one's passed from father to father to father because only the male get the Y chromosome. So each of these different DNA types has a unique type of inheritance pattern. And we'll talk about mostly about autosomal today and that inheritance pattern. So all of these autosomal and the X and Y DNA, those are in the cell nucleus. Then there's also the mitochondrial DNA that you can test, and that one is found outside of the cell nucleus. So again, today we're going to be talking about autosomal DNA because that's the one that most of us will be taking in our DNA tests. So when you have those 2 chromosomes, every time a child is created, the autosomal DNA splits and then it recombines. So to help you understand that, we have the blue from the father and the pink from the mother, and it splits. So we have 2 blues and 2 pinks. So we have 4 copies of chromosome 1 now. And then these can recombine in any type of order. So then when I inherit it from my parent, my chromosome 1 will have a mix of blue and pink because I got some from my dad and some from my mom. So when we talk about recombination, that's just when these DNA segments exchange and then create the new chromosome in the child. So what this means is, obviously, we get 50% of our DNA, autosomal DNA, from our father and 50% from our mother. But because when my father got it from his parents, they were recombining. So I'm not going to get an exact 25% from my grandpa. I might only get 20% of my paternal grandpa. And then I've got the 30% was my maternal grandma. And so when I get my dad's 50%, I didn't get an exact 25% from each grandparent. I may have more or less when it gets to the grandparent level, and then each generation back, that goes even further to where the amount you may inherit on your paternal line is different than the maternal line. And so by the time you get to your 3rd cousin level, there are cases where you and a 3rd cousin will not share a DNA segment just because of the DNA lottery, because of what you inherit. So by the time you get to be 4th cousins, you will have 4th cousins that you won't share DNA with. And that's important to remember. So if you by some chance know who your 4th cousin is and you've tested and you're like, oh no, they're not on my DNA test results, well, that's not too surprising. So far to date, of all the studies that have been done, you always share DNA with your 2nd cousin. You will share at least some segments with a 2nd cousin. So, so any questions up to this point? This is because we're going to build on this to go forward. So you get 50% from each parent, and then you're going to get about 25% from each grandparent. Okay. So these DNA segments are measured in a unit called centimorgans, and you'll see that abbreviated CM all the time. So centimorgans is a measurement of genetic distance. So it's not, I mean, you can think of it as centimeters. It's a little bit easy to remember because it is a measurement, but it's actually not a length, it is the genetic distance. So when you get your DNA test results, it's going to report to you how many centimorgans you share with your DNA match. So in this case, just by way of background, so all of the images here I'm getting from my husband's DNA test, and he's given me permission to share his DNA information. Anybody else who's living, you'll see that I've privatized their names. So unless I have written permission from somebody, I'm not going to show you their names or pictures. But you get the idea that this is my husband's test kit, and here are some of his DNA matches. This one that starts with a J, he shares 238 centimorgans, and that's across 12 different segments. Because they're second and third cousins, they share multiple segments. And so total, it's 238 centimorgans. With this match that starts with an A, it's 236. And then we've got this last cousin that's 226. So this is the key information. This is why you take a DNA test, is to find out who your DNA matches are. So the higher number of centimorgans that you share with somebody means you're closer together, because you're getting much more concentrated of your parents' DNA or your grandparents' DNA. So for example, this is the top of my husband's list. This is his sister. You can see he shares almost 3,000 centimorgans with her. And then his nephew is down at 1,800 centimorgans. He's got a first cousin that's only 1,500 centimorgans, and then his half-sister is also only 1,500. So it's interesting, right, that he shares more with his nephew than he does his half-sister. And we'll show you a little bit on why that works that way. So the lower than the number of centimorgans you share means you're further distantly related. It also means there's more possible relationships. Because if I'm inheriting a lot more from my paternal grandmother, let's say, than I am from my maternal grandmother, then any DNA matches I have on that paternal grandmother's line, I'm going to have longer segments to match more people with. But that means that there's quite a variety. So for example, let's look. So here, this is called the Shared Centimorgan Project Tool. And this author, Blaine Bettinger, he had people submit, I mean, I can't remember the numbers, it's over 70,000 DNA entries of people, excuse me. So the people are showing how much DNA they share, and then they say, well, this is how many centimorgans I share with my second cousin, or this is how many centimorgans I share with my sister. And so you'll see there's always two numbers. The first number is the average amount that people would share with a great-grandparent. The second number is the range. People have been shown to share with a great-grandparent as little as 485 centimorgans, or as high as 1,400 centimorgans. I mean, that's quite a range coming from your great-grandparent, right? Here, for example, is the second cousin. If I have a second cousin, it might be as low as 41 centimorgans, or it could be as close as 592. So again, the lower the centimorgans, the more distantly related you are. But knowing the number of centimorgans and looking at a chart like this can then indicate and give you a clue as to what relationship you might be with your DNA match. Okay, so that's, I just dumped on you a week worth of classes on DNA. So any questions so far on that? Okay, all right, well, we'll bury you a little further and then see if you know what questions you want to ask. So because of the factor that the amount of centimorgans you share with somebody can vary, it is critical that DNA evidence is always combined with documentary evidence. So you can never just look at your DNA and say, oh, this is my second cousin. We use DNA for clue, we use it for confirmation, for evidence, but we're always doing it in tandem. So when I'm doing a DNA project for a client, for example, I typically start with the documentary evidence. I say, let's see what census we could find or a vital record. And then we'll build back a couple generations, and then we look at the DNA and say, oh, look, these DNA matches fit into this family tree that we built. And that's all great. And then we go back to a second great grandparent, let's say, and all of a sudden there are no records. We've looked, we've checked all these different records, and we cannot find this client's second great grandparent. So then what we do is we go back into the DNA and we say, well, let's look at which DNA matches might come from that second great grandparent. And all of a sudden we'll find a group of these DNA matches that we can't fit on any other part of our tree. And come to find out they're all in Ohio. And we start looking at records in Ohio. We know the name we're looking for, and it helps point us to a record. And we're like, oh, look, here they are in the census. It was just spelled wrong in the census, or, some other reason. So DNA and documentary evidence really needs to be used in tandem. And hopefully you can see why on that. So let's look again at this shared Centrimorgan project and how you'd actually use it, practically speaking. So if we go back to, excuse me, our DNA match list, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute, and it'll say that we share 229 Centrimorgans. I can come to the site and put that number in, and it highlights all of the possible relationships. Okay. It also tells you what the probability is. So if I'm 229 that I'm sharing with the DNA match, there's over a 50% chance that I'm one of these relationships up here in the top box. Nephew, maybe a first cousin twice removed, just a lot of different options there. But there's also a 35% chance that I'm a half second cousin or one of these other relationships. Now, it's possible there's a 9% chance that I'm one of these smaller relationships, but because the chance is less, if I really think that I'm, for example, a half first cousin, I'm going to want to make sure that I really have some good documentary evidence to back that up, because it's not as likely as these other relationships are. So steps to take is you get your DNA match, you're trying to figure out who this one is, and you say, well, I can look up what my possible relationships are. So you put the number of Centrimorgans and you push enter, and it'll highlight which possible relationships 229 Centrimorgans could be. Okay, so they've developed tools like this to help you interpret how to use your DNA results. And my goal today is to help you kind of see some of the tools and understand the process, because that will give you a better idea on how to actually, what the possibilities are on using it for evidence on building a tree.
Julie, I have a question before you continue.
Yes.
This DNA painter, is it free? Is it cost? Or how does it work?
This is a free tool. And DNA Painter does have some tools on their site that do cost, but most of their tools are free. And then you can paint your chromosomes and actually paint, or label is a better word, which segments came from which great-grandparent or which great-great-grandparent. And your first painting or your first labeling of the chromosomes is free. But then if you want to do a couple more, then they charge you. So most of their tools on this site are free, but a few of them do cost. This one, the Shared Centrimorgan project, is free. So good question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about testing. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, where do I test? And part of that depends on what is your goal. And if I'm working with a client, then we talk about what's our research question. What are we trying to find? So one of the projects, we were back in 1760 Virginia. We were stuck. We checked all the records possible, and we'd really like to find out if a great grandparent came from over in England. So we could do the Y DNA because it doesn't recombine as often, and it can go back more generations. For the most part, for what most people are doing, they're going to be testing at one of these 4 places. And so I tried to say, kind of, here's the pros and the cons and what you can get out of it. So Ancestry has the largest database, and we'll look at those numbers in a minute. They also have trees and they have records, and it makes building the trees of your DNA matches fast and easy. And it also gives you the biggest chance of finding DNA matches. But not everybody tests an Ancestry. 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage. All 4 of these are autosomal DNA tests. And so you're going to get different matches depending on where you test. 23andMe, they've made their focus the medical. And of course, on their site, they say this cannot be considered medical advice, but you can find out some of your hereditary predispositions, maybe some of your genes that might cause some concerns in your health. That being said, you do need to realize that they don't test all of your genes. I have a friend, she tested 23andMe. It showed no hereditary breast cancer genes, but her mom has hereditary breast cancer. And so she went and did a full genetic test. And sure enough, she does have that BRCA variant. So 23andMe does have the medical, but they don't test. It's not a full genetic panel. They're only testing the most, the ones where the most variation comes that help with family history. So Family Tree DNA, they're the company that also tests for Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And then MyHeritage is another autosomal test company. So let's, a couple tips first. People ask me, is there any benefit to getting a DNA test? Why would I want to do it? The first thing I always say is, well, if you're going to buy a DNA test and you're just buying one, give it to your oldest grandparent first. Because of the recombination, because every time a child is born, you're getting half of the segment, half of the DNA. If you test your grandparent, you're going to have a lot more concentration of that DNA on that line, right? That makes sense. So if you're going to do a DNA test, talk to grandparents or parents, or aunts and uncles who are willing, if your parents or grandparents aren't alive, and test your oldest possible candidates, because they're going to give you more answers. The other thing is watch for sales prices throughout the year. The autosomal DNA tests have come down quite a bit. Black Friday is a good time. Roots Tech that just ended, they still have some sales left from that, but that's usually about the price range on their sale prices. So normally they're around $100, but so that'll give you some idea on what that's looking like. So here's the DNA test companies. And again, this is in the handout, so you can review it later. But this will show you a couple of things to help you decide on where you might want to test. So big factor, Ancestry does have 20 million in their database, which is unbelievable. So when in doing DNA for family history 10 years ago, you just didn't have a lot of matches, and it really made some of it take a lot longer. With these kind of numbers in the database, that's a lot of possible DNA matches. Now, if you have relatives that come from other countries and a lot of immigrant ancestors, what I didn't put on this one is MyHeritage is a little bit more worldwide. So if I'm working with a client who has like Eastern European or some of the other countries, they're not as many have taken DNA tests to begin with. And MyHeritage is a more global company, so I tend to have them test on MyHeritage. You can test at all of them, but you'll notice down here that some of these companies will let you upload your DNA data from other companies. So Ancestry and 23, they don't allow you to upload your DNA, but the MyHeritage and Family Tree, they will let you do that, and we'll look at that in a second. But one of the things that once you get into using DNA a little bit more is if you on Ancestry, for example, you just find out that you share these 225 centimorgans. You don't know which chromosome it's on. You could be sharing on any of those 22 chromosomes. Some of the other testing companies, you'll notice these 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree, they do give you the segment data. So if I'm looking at a DNA match and I'm saying, wow, we both share this segment on chromosome 17 at the same start and stop location, that's a much, much bigger piece of evidence, because you know that you can find all the DNA matches on that segment, and then you have a group who all come from the same ancestor. So, and so the chromosome browser just lets you view some of that DNA segment data. So for most of the people that are beginning in DNA, most of the stuff on this part of the chart just doesn't make a difference. I think what does make a difference is capturing DNA of people whose DNA might help you in 10 years when you hit some brick walls, and that's your best option to expand your tree. So in the genetic genealogy community, they call it fishing in all the ponds. And so what they're saying is transfer your DNA to any other database that allows it. So an example would be you could test at Ancestry. You get those 20 million DNA matches. And then you can upload to MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, who allow the uploads. Now, some of your matches will be the same as you had on Ancestry, but you'll also have a new set of matches that you can look at. So it just increases the number of chances of finding a DNA match on the part of your tree that you're trying to focus on. So the most powerful DNA tool, or what creates evidence from DNA, is your shared match list. So when you get your Ancestry results, you can look at your tree, you can search their records, or you can look at your DNA. And when you click on your DNA, this is your DNA match list. This is the list that comes up. And when I click on one of my matches, it'll show that, in this case, my husband Theron, he matches DNA with this G DNA match. And they share, you'll notice they're sharing 25 centimorgans. So you can tell that the predicted relationship is way back at 4th to 6th cousins. But we were trying to break through. My husband's Stoddard line stops in New Jersey in 1780. So we were trying to find everybody who matches on that line to see if we could find some more records to search. But this is the shared match list. So you'll notice on here, I'm on the tab that says shared matches. So Theron and the G match here, they match with all of these same people. They're a shared match. So Theron and G match with this match, and with this one, and this one, and this one. And so if all of these people share DNA with each other, the chances are high that they descend from a common ancestor. That DNA segment's going to come from a great-great-grandparent, and it's going to get passed down to all of these descendants. And then they take a DNA test and they all match. And so what we're doing is we're looking at these people and we're saying, well, I'm going to look at this person's tree and see who our common ancestor is. Now you'll see some of your DNA matches, they just took it. They wanted to find out their ethnicities. Where did my ancestors come from? So they don't have a tree. Some of them have a tree on Ancestry, but they haven't linked it up to their DNA, but you can still go look at them. A lot of the people will have no tree, or just a couple people in their tree. But I can look at the trees of this match and start to say, oh, look, they all come on this Stoddard branch. I know that this is a Stoddard match. And then sure enough, I started researching her information. Her tree wasn't very big, but I did some research and I found out she was the she descends from William Stoddard through Sarah and then this Abigail line. So I'm putting in the notes that who our common ancestor is. So I know that Theron and the G match share through William Stoddard. So that's the big picture of why DNA is helpful. So we're going to go into a little more detail now on, okay, how can I do that? Again, this is what the professionals spend most of their days doing when they're working with DNA as evidence. They're looking at the shared match list. And you're just building up the trees and you're finding the common ancestor. That is how DNA is helpful on building your tree. So how do we actually use the DNA? Let's talk about that. You'll notice, again, this is my husband's. It's his DNA match list. They give you several options. You can search, like, let's say I wanted to find everybody who had the Stoddard surname in their tree. I can use that search feature there. I can also see, we'll look at how you can put if you hook up your tree to your DNA, and other people have done the same thing, then Ancestry goes through and he says, oh, look, you guys have a common ancestor on your tree. And they come down, and I don't even have to do any research on these DNA matches. Ancestry already shows that here's your DNA match, here's you, and you guys come back to this common ancestor up here. And so what we do is we start looking at these DNA matches and we label. These are all of my labels. I say, this is a shared match. And I put this common DNA person that I was using to look at all our shared matches. And then I'm putting the relationship to William Stoddard, because I'm trying to get these DNA matches to find enough information on him to verify that we've got his correct father. And then the newer tool that Ancestry's added is called DNA Groups, and you'll see that option here. And this lets us start to put our ancestors into groups. Yeah, go ahead. Is there a question?
So bad. She's driving me nuts. I like her information.
Oh.
It's interesting, but she does that.
Okay, so this is how you want to start. You would open up your DNA match list and you start looking down here. And I, of course, start with people that already have the tree built for me and they know who my common ancestor is. And then we're going to go in and we're going to label those DNA matches. We're going to put our labels here. And then these colored dots that you see are the groups that I've added them to. Because if I can get a whole group who descend from this particular ancestor, that increases the amount of evidence that we all come from that same person. So I'm going to show you how that works a little bit. So these are the steps we're going to follow. We're going to create DNA groups for our 8 great-grandparents. And then we're going to say, okay, those are my main groups, but I'm actually trying to research this second great-grandfather. So I'm going to create a group just for him. And then I'm going to look at those common ancestors and I'm going to put them into one of those groups. And then I'm going to start looking at those shared matches and build up that DNA group. And once I have a pretty good DNA group, that's my evidence that I've got the right second great-grandfather. So let me show you what Ancestry's done with their DNA groups. They, as both Ancestry and MyHeritage has this tool for creating groups. I've done most of my work on Ancestry just because MyHeritage groups only came out a couple months ago. So most of my screenshots are from Ancestry, but be aware we can do the same thing on MyHeritage. If you test at one of the other companies, you can also do it in a spreadsheet. That's how a lot of us had to do it before the DNA groups option came out, is we would just build our groups out on a spreadsheet. So you've got this option on your DNA match list. So again, I come to Ancestry, I go to the DNA tab, and one of the options is my DNA match list. Once my matches are all displayed down here, I can say I want to add or create groups. And so the groups option, when I click on that, you can see the groups that I've already created. Okay. So what I chose to do is I wanted to group all of my DNA matches based on my great grandparents. So great grandfather, in this case, it would be my husband Stoddard, and then on down the line. So I have a different color at this level. Now, if you're from somewhere that had a lot of immigrant ancestors, you may not have as many DNA matches, and then you may want to just do 4 groups for your grandparents. For example, if I look at Ancestry, I think I'm like 59,000 DNA matches. Now I'm only going to use the top, 10% of those, but for most of the research I do. But if you have a lot of ancestors, you can see why there'd be a benefit to group them by the great grandparent. And so as I do that, the Stoddard great grandfather, he married a Telford. So any DNA matches that's Stoddard or Telford, I'm going to put in that box. And then the next one's down. I've got the next one is my coffin line. So you'll notice that when I'm naming these groups, I'm choosing to name the group with the surnames of the parents of my great grandparents, because my Stoddard married a Telford. I want to be able to put both of those into the same group. I didn't want to create 16 or 20 groups that I had to track everybody. So I just wanted to keep them all into 8 groups. So anybody that's further back on this line, if I got more people up here, like if I have somebody that's up here, I just stick them into this group, and then it keeps all of my DNA matches together, unless I'm focusing on somebody, and then I'll create an extra group for whoever my target ancestor I'm researching. So let me try wording it a little different way and see if that helps, because this is sometimes where people get a little bit hung up. They're just like, how do I even start? If you're picturing your DNA match list, when you look down, let's just go back here and look. When I'm looking at this DNA match list, if I look at these colors, I know that the purple and the pink are all on the maternal line. Or I can say all the blues and greens come from this great grandfather. And so then I can just start to focus on only the DNA matches that matter. So that's why I start with just my first 8 groups. I name them after the surnames of the great grandparents, parents. And then if one of them is unknown, let's say this is the one I'm finding, all I know is this great grandparent was the father of Levi Coffin. I don't know his name. So I make a group for him, and because I'm going to especially look for any DNA match that might be related, descended from this Levi Coffin. So when you go to the groups option and you create a custom group, Ancestry has these colors from you, they give you 24 choices of colors. So I try to keep everything on this half of the color scheme. I do all of that maternal, and everything on this half I use from my paternal research. So I can look at the colored dot on my match list and I say, oh, that's on my maternal line. I'm not researching them right now. I'm not gonna look at them. So when I create my 8 great grandparents, I find this middle row is really distinguishable. And so that's how I start to create my groups and assign a color. And then on these, you'll see I've got other groups that we're going to create here in a minute, and then I can use these extra colors up here and down there. Again, I try to find distinct colors when possible, just because I tend to have a lot of different people that I'm researching. So you'll notice when I created my list, normally it does it alphabetically. I like adding an additional group for all my maternal matches and all the paternal ones. So if I'm looking at some unknown match and I look at all the shared matches of that person, I can say, look, all of the dots on this person are blue. All of the shared matches are blue. This must be on my paternal side. And then for my other ones, after I've got my main groups, then I'll actually put a number at the front of my group because I want to force it to be in the order that I want. And then once I get those, then I'll say, okay, that's going to be kind of my reference group, but I want to target this specific. I really need to find Israel Stoddard and his wife, Sarah. And so I'll create a couple of DNA groups where I can start to put in the matches. So some people, either a parent or a grandparent, it's unknown. And so I'll create a group and I'll just say, this is for my unknown father. And I name it that, and I start to find a group of matches that all fit together that aren't on my maternal line. And I can put them into this paternal unknown group. And I can start to look at all of those in the shared match group and say, who's their common ancestor? Well, that's where this unknown parent comes from. So as you're labeling and grouping your DNA matches, there's some genealogy standards. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want you to be aware of some of the pitfalls. In fact, I think we'll just go right here. So when I look at a shared match on my DNA match list, they have a beautiful tree, but I can't trust that tree all the time, right? The accuracy of their tree is something that I'm going to kind of need to look at and make sure that I agree with the tree they built. So don't always trust the tree that your DNA match made. And remember that their tree isn't always complete. So you may look at their tree and it shows all these surnames, but further back, they may have a different set of surnames that you might match a couple places on that tree, especially if you go to colonial America, or like, for example, the Ashkenazi Jewish. It's possible that you and your DNA match might share segments on more than one line. And then we're going to talk about small segments, because your DNA segments can get small enough that they're just those A, T, C's, and G's just line up by chance. So here's an example. So here's my husband and some of our DNA matches. If my tree is not complete, I may show the DNA match also has a Hunt on his line, and I'm not aware that he has some other surnames that we share in common. And so the reason that DNA always takes documentary research is, first of all, you can study your shared matches tree and then do the documentary research and say, yes, I can see where the documents point that we both share this common ancestor. So DNA will give you the clue, confirm it with documentary research. This is just an example on Ancestry. It shows how many people's trees are not complete. So if you go to the second great grandparent, about 50% of people, their trees aren't complete. So, and this is just an example. I was trying to break through on the Stoddard line. I find all of these DNA matches had Stoddard, and I was just like, great, they all go back to Anthony. I've won, I've got this solved. Come to find out, they shared on a different line. They were all on our Belknap line. So it just takes, make sure that you're looking at the documents along with the DNA. The other thing to be aware of is once your DNA segments get under 10 centimorgans, that might just be by chance, and they might be fault segments. So that's just a reminder. So let's look at the common ancestor option. So when you hook up your DNA match to a tree, then Ancestry will try and find the common ancestor for you. And they give you this icon. And as you're going through, if you start with the ones that you already know have a common ancestor, that really helps you label and group your matches faster. This is what the MyHeritage DNA match list looks like. You can see the information they give. Here's my grouping, she's in my green group. And what this does is, by labeling and putting your DNA matches into groups, it gives you kind of this reference set that you can compare all your DNA matches against. So let me just show you real quick how to hook up your tree. You'd go into DNA, your results summary, and click on the settings. And then it just lets you link up your tree to your DNA results. And that's how most of the DNA tools on Ancestry work, is by having your DNA hooked up to a tree. And it'll help you build those trees. So you'll notice I add my notes, and that lets me remember when I'm looking at my match list where I've already figured out that they fit in. So here's an example. I clicked on the common ancestor button and it said our common ancestor was Charles Henry Stoddard. But I start looking at the tree, and I also share, well, my husband shares with this gentleman on 2 different lines. So, all right, let me just ask, are there any questions? Again, just keep in mind that DNA, just give yourself 2 or 3 times of hearing how you work through it and practice it a little bit. And then all of these pieces fall into place. It's always challenging to try and do a whole overview of DNA in an hour because there are multiple aspects to it.
Julie,
yes.
I might have a question again.
Okay.
A few slides back, you showed that you started your dots with your great-grandparents.
Yeah, let me go back there.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Can you start even later? I mean, in an earlier generation, like the great-great-grandparents, because like in my tree, I have 2 illegitimate births where I have no idea who the father is.
Yeah.
But it is a great-great-grandparent. Can I use this one as a starting point, or is it the child then? Or?
That's a great question. I start with the 8 great-grandparents because I want to get some DNA matches in those groups. So they again become a reference sample. So if I put my easy to find matches into these 8 great-grandparents, then when I come down here, I would do my 2nd great-grandparents in a focus group because they're a target. And the reason I do that is then if we come up here when we're looking at our DNA matches, well, here's an example. So this is a tool on Ancestry, and it shows you how your DNA matches are related, right? So this way I can see how they're related, but let's say that I don't have that option and I'm looking at a DNA match and I think they're on this illegitimate line, and I need to look at their shared matches and say, could this match be on that illegitimate line? If I click on those shared matches and all of a sudden I'm finding they're all the wrong color dot because they're in those first 8 groups, then I'll say, oh, this one's not on my illegitimate group because they're all the wrong color group. They're all on my maternal line. And then I don't study that shared match.
Oh, okay. I
where if I've used those 8 great-grandparents and I kind of have 6 or 8 or 10 DNA matches in each of my 8 great-grandparents, then when I click on a shared match and I say, okay, I want to, for example, let's say we want to look at this person. Let's see, I didn't do, so here's the shared matches. So we share matches with all of these people. By having, I can see, wow, they're all sharing the same color group. I think this person matches on that illegitimate line because they're all, everybody in the shared match list have the same colored dots.
Oh, okay, yes.
So then I can say, oh, look, I don't know on this person. I have not studied. I don't know which tree he comes on. He might give me a clue to who that 2nd great-grandparent is. And if I study, 5 trees and they all come from this Belknap surname, then I can say, wow, I better start researching Belknap. I didn't know I was related to any Belknaps. And that's the illegitimate line.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. So just in closing, let me show you another way to look at it to understand why shared matches matter. So here's a client I'm working with. we had his tree build up to this point, and we are stuck in the records. We just cannot find parents. He's got a DNA match that I know comes from this couple. And so I go into this DNA match and I say, all right, who are Troy's shared matches? And I start saying, I'm finding all of these shared matches, and I start putting them out, and I say, on Ancestry, they have these trees that go back here, but look, they're all sharing matches together, right? So I'm seeing this genetic network is what they call it. It's this network of people who are all sharing with each other. Well, that means they're related. So I say, okay, I'm going to start building the trees up a little further for all of these people. And this is what I get. I start building up all their trees, and I can find out how they're related, find out she has a second husband. 2 of the DNA matches came down there. I start looking for records over here and find out that Sarah and Susanna were sisters, and I at least know the father now. So by building these genetic networks and saying they're all related, then I can research these people. I start building their trees, and I find out where they're all related, and their common ancestor was this William Marcus, and it pushes my tree back. So here's another example of the same thing. This is the same chart we just looked at, but I have 3 more DNA matches who I cannot get out of Crawford, Missouri. Notice that they're in Tennessee and Missouri. So I have this hypothesis that these people, because they share with all the same descendants, these people here are going to come from the same William Marcus. So if I start looking for records on these people, I might find new records to help lead me to Martha's surname. That was our research goal. So those are the steps. Any questions? Again, just realize we just condensed a week's worth of learning into 1 hour. My biggest goal was to give you an idea on that DNA can be used as a part of evidence for building your tree. Go ahead.
I have a question. I use, I had my test done at Family Tree DNA and then also at Ancestry, and I've uploaded the Family Tree DNA results to Genealogy, which is a company now owned by Ancestry, but based in France.
Right.
With a much smaller database, largely European.
Yes.
So I've got well over 20,000 Ancestry hits or matches. And
that's great.
Only 200 some odd in Genealogy. And because the Genealogy set is so much smaller, there are no close matches. The largest, the closest is someone with whom I share 43 centimorgans.
Okay.
And that's, I looked into that person's tree and found multiple common ancestors. So one question is, when you've got a fairly small, I mean, 43 in that set is, I say, was large, but the examples you were using are hundreds, 200 or 400 or 1,400.
Right.
So you're dealing with very close relatives. And so this person is someone who's probably a 6th or 7th or 8th cousin many times over.
Yes, or could be closer, right?
Based on comparing his tree with my tree, I mean, I'm confident that I know where we connect.
Okay,
and it's
great.
Way back.
Yeah. Okay.
But related to that, because I have all these people with smaller, we have 23 centimorgans or 15 centimorgans.
Right.
If they have a tree, and if the tree goes back far enough to show a common ancestor, and it's 6 or 8 or 10 generations back, the centimorgan chart that you were using at the very beginning showed that within 5 or 6 generations, you can have the possibility exists of having 0 centimorgans match.
Correct. Yeah.
So So can I trust that when I'm finding a match 6 or 8 or 10 generations back, and we share 14 centimorgans, can I trust that what I'm seeing is true?
So you're right that that 6 generations is typically the threshold where they're saying it can help up to 6. When you get to the 7th and 8th, because small segments might be inherited from multiple different, I mean, there's multiple lines that you might share. By the time you go back 8 generations, you might have 2 or 3 lines that you share on, and most people don't have their tree completely done at 8 generations. So it becomes a question of how many DNA matches can you find that goes to that common ancestor, which is one reason that you saw in that tree. I ended up finding 8 to 10 DNA matches from that, 6th generation back grandfather, because I wanted to show we've got multiple people that tie in that all share DNA with each other and go back 6 to 8 generations. So the further back you want to use DNA, the more DNA matches you'd use.
Yeah.
To help show that. But anything under 10 centimorgans, that might be true, but you'd have to use chromosome browsers and paint your segments to really establish that.
But the sort of work you were doing to create that Marcus Marx hypothesis, I mean, that presupposes that all of those people have at least some of their ancestry available for you to look at. So,
yes.
So none of these people are among those that didn't put their tree in Ancestry or had only their parents or grandparents.
Yeah.
So you had something to work with.
If they list their parents, I can usually build a tree for them between public databases.
Yeah. Okay.
And I start on Family Search. Yeah. If I have a grandparent, then I'm usually great because I can get into the 1940 census and go back, or newspapers. So I've also used Facebook, and I've a couple of key DNA matches I needed for an unknown parentage case. It was a unique surname and a unique first name, and I found them on Facebook and confirmed that they were friends with a couple other DNA matches. And I built back a tree for somebody who had no tree at all. And so it is possible, but yeah, it takes more work. But you can see where building back the trees, I now know to go research records in this Crawford, Missouri, and in McMinn, Tennessee, right? So DNA is great for pointing to records.
Okay. I had not noticed the shared matches option in Ancestry DNA.
Yeah, shared matches. So I've got a friend who works for Ancestry's progenealogist, and she says 90% of her day for unknown parentage or 6 generations back, she's looking at shared matches all day, every day. It's just the tool that people use. Because the fact that all of these share with each other indicates that I've got them on the right line.
Yeah.
And by researching all of their records, I was able to find a record. So I couldn't find any record that told Sarah Marcus's parents, but I started finding records once I knew these other children, and then I could start putting the family together and find the records to build out the family.
Okay. One unrelated question to that, briefly. Is it possible? I mean, do you know of the existence of that a DNA segment can persist, that there's something about the structure of it, that it persists generation after generation? And
yes.
So that it doesn't get recombined, that the entire segment or almost the entire segment is inherited generation after generation?
Yes, yeah, that's definitely. And in fact, there's what's called pileup regions. Some of those segments stay intact for so long that you'll be looking, when you can look at the segment data, you'll be looking at your DNA segments and you share them with these different segments. And all of a sudden you hit one segment and you share like with 20 people on the same segment. And that's just because this segment is so common and it just didn't recombine for 10 or 12 generations back. And so it just got spread. The problem is it could have been even 15 generations back, so it may not be genetically significant. So you
can't count on something like that to be an indicator of relationship.
Right. So it is possible that, it just came all the way down from William all the way to every one of these, right? I mean, every one of these people have a segment from William or Martha. that we know of. And he may have gotten that same segment 3 generations back. So it's possible, but because there's so many options on the tree that far back, you can't be sure that the segment that you're looking at came from one specific ancestor. It may have come from any of those 32, 5th great grandparents or however many that is. And that's why they get into the chromosome mapping, where you say, look, I've got 10 people who all share. If I look at the segment data, and this is on chromosome 17 at the start, and they all share the same on chromosome 17,
Right.
then it's much more likely that I can really prove that it came from William and Martha.
Okay.
And so I would paint that segment and say, that one goes to William. But on a 15 Centimorgan segment, it's really hard to paint it and really prove that it goes back to a specific person.
Unless you have a large tree like this, that
Yes,
where it's shared by all of the descendants.
Yeah, so the more numbers you have here, the better the evidence, right? The
Okay.
chances that every one of these people share in this genetic network with multiple people in the group, it just strengthens the evidence that it came from this couple.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Julie, there was this one question that was sent in before the meeting from Joseph, and I don't see Joseph here, so I will just read you the question.
Okay.
DNA tests are all the rage right now, and I would like to take a test, but I don't want to give my DNA sequence to a for-profit company. Do you know of any non-profit DNA tests, perhaps through research institutions such as universities?
So I did a little looking after you emailed me that question. This is, again, it comes back to why does he want his DNA tested? If he's looking for medical, I know IHC has a big genetic test going on. If he's interested in helping with cold case, like police work, this is a nonprofit DNA testing. The only one I know of in the country is this Cold Case Coalition. So I'll send you the link to this. So I think the bigger question is why. I mean, I understand the not wanting the for-profit, worried about, for whatever reason, he doesn't want to go with a for-profit one. What's he hoping to get out of the DNA? If he's doing it for building a, genealogy tree, then you need to have the shared matches. And so testing with somebody who's not for profit, you don't get the shared matches, so it doesn't meet his needs. So I think I can email you, the IHC in this one, but it really depends on what is his goal in doing a DNA test. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Maybe I would give Jeremy your email address. Or
that's a good way to.
This, then he can contact you directly.
Okay. Okay, that sounds great.
Any other questions? Last chance.
Okay, well, don't get discouraged, because if you spend a little time on DNA, it does get easier, and it's really great on building trees. So.
All right. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording.
Okay, and thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate that.